Welcome, everybody. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome you here today, another event of our Center for Middle Eastern Studies office here at Harvard University, and I will introduce Gabriele more formally. But on a little bit of a note, my own work deals with Ibn Hamdis al-Saqili. And Ibn Hamdis, who died in 1133, came from a family from Sfax, and they were part of, his great-great-grandfather was part of the expedition that left Susa in the year 817 and invaded the island of Sicily, and it began what would be 4 centuries of Muslim and Arabic presence on the island of Sicily. And oddly enough, one of my second areas of research, I deal with the CEMAT تحت السور. I work in modern Arabic literature, and dealing with people like Ali Douaji and the Khrayef brothers. I eventually came to know a person by the name of Zain al-Abidin al-Sunusi. And in 1943, Zain al-Abidin al-Sunusi went on a journalist expedition to Italy, where he was arrested immediately, and he was jailed for a period of time, after which he spent several years in Rome because he couldn't come back because he had been condemned to death by the French colonial government. And in Sicily, during his years of exile in Sicily, he discovered Ibn Hamdis, and he wrote 2 major works on Ibn Hamdis. So my work on the Jama'at Taht al-Sur and my work on Muslim Sicily ties together the Italians in Tunisia. So your history is long, it's very rich, and when Gabriele wrote to me and asked and suggested that he come here, I was absolutely delighted. So the histories of Sicily, particularly Sicily, but Italy in general, and Tunisia, are a history that is long, and it's rich, and it's close. For those of you who've been to Sicily, you walk down the street and everybody looks Tunisian, and when you go downtown to La Marsa, for instance, everybody looks Sicilian. So I just wanted to start off the conversation the evening by saying that it is a great pleasure for me to host this particular talk tonight. Gabriele Montalbano is a PhD candidate at l'Ecole Pratique des Etudes in Paris. He has his BA in 2012 from the University of Bologna, which I believe is the oldest university in the West, if correct? Okay. He has his MA in 2014 from the Ecole Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he worked on the anti-fascist movement of the within the Italian community in Tunisia. His doctoral work focuses on nation building processes among migrant communities in the 19th and 20th century, and links between migration, colonialism, and social representation, subjects that were extremely important during the 19th century, and unfortunately, or possibly fortunately in some ways, the idea of migration and movements and colonialism and neo-colonialism has come back in full force here in this 21st century as well. So Gabriele's work is immensely important, not only for historians of the 19th and 20th century, but for those of us humanists and social scientists who are working on these particular interests as well. His work is solidly grounded in Mediterraneanism, and I tell my students all the time, and I can defend myself, which I had to do, that to me, Tunisia is the most Mediterranean of countries. Tunis akbar balad Bahran Abyada Mutawassitan, and I'll be able to defend that later on if you'd like. Anyway, without further ado, Gabriele Montalbano, it's a pleasure to have you, and I'll turn over the floor to you.
First of all, I would like to say thank you all for coming this afternoon. Especially, I'd like to thank the Center of Middle Eastern Studies of Harvard and CEMAT for hosting this presentation. And a special thanks also to Professor Granara and Sihem Lamin for the organization. So this lecture will be divided into 2 parts. One will be an introduction about the history of the Italian immigration and the main characteristics of its settlement in Tunisia, and the other one will focus on the Italian nation building process in the French colonial context until the First World War. The Italian presence in Tunisian Regency had profound and stratified historical roots, who started much before the French Protectorate. Italian-speaking communities were present in Tunisian Regency from early modern age, and they were composed mainly of merchants, like the Genoese merchants and the Jews from Livorno, or slaves captured by the Tunisian corsairs. It could be confusing saying Italian presence before the existence of an Italian state or nation. I define Italian-speaking presence as a people from Italian peninsula with an Italian-related language or dialect. So, as we can see, first Italian-speaking settlers were the so-called Tabarchinians, longshore fishermen from Genoa, settled in Tabarca in 1544, when a Lomellini merchant family bought this island in order to exploit its coral. In the 18th century, the demographic pressure in the little island of Tabarca laid the foundation of a new settlement in Sardinia, Carloforte. During this period, the Tunisian army and corsairs put in slavery the settlers of Tabarca, who joined the other Christian slaves coming mainly from Italian, Sicilian and Sardinian coasts. Moreover, some of the Tabarcinian slaves were sold from the Tunisian bay to the Dey of Algiers, and then redeemed by the king of Spain and settled close to Alicante in the little island that they called New Tabarca, Nueva Tabarca. The second settlement was composed of the Jewish merchants from Livorno, Tuscany. Here in Tunis they were called Grana, from the Arab name of the city of Livorno, El Gorna in Arabic. So Grana meant people of Livorno, plural of Gorni. In Medina of Tunis there is still Souk al Grana, the street in which these Sephardi Jews lived and worked. The Sephardi Jews from Livorno came from the Iberian Peninsula. After the persecution in Spain and in Portugal, they found refuge in the Tuscan harbor thanks to special laws and treatments guaranteed by the Grand Duke Ferdinand II in 1591. Little by little, these Jewish merchants acquired the language and the culture of Tuscany. From 19th century until the Second World War, Grana community played a significant role in the major Italian community. So at the beginning of the 19th century, when the piracy in Mediterranean was abolished, the Italian-speaking presence in Tunisia were formed mainly by merchants, as the Jews from Livorno, the merchants from Genoa. The abolition of slavery in 1846, thanks to Ahmed Bey, helped to increase the foreign settlement. During this century, some Italian political refugees found in Tunisia a safe place. From then on, Sicilian and Sardinians, who visited frequently Tunisian coast as fishermen, settled in the main cities of the Regency. But it was after the French occupation of Tunisia in 1881 that the colonial exploitation, that a huge mass migration from Sicily, Sardinia, and south of Italy came in this African country looking for better economic conditions. This new migration changed the social composition of the Italian presence in Tunisia, from a merchant to a working class presence. We can point out that the migrants from Sicily, the main part of the new migration, came from the western side of the island, mostly from Trapani region, Agrigento and Palermo countryside. Moreover, the little Sicilian island of Pantelleria, whose name came from the Arabic daughter of the winds, Bint al-Ariha, had a huge migration of peasants towards Cape Bon and Enfida region. Sicilians in Tunisia were mainly working class. They worked as bricklayer peasants, farmers. Sardinians instead came from Sulcis region in the south, and they were mainly mine workers. They emigrated from a mine region to another, and the mine owners as well. Jebel Resas or Jebel Arsas was one of the spots, as well as Kala Gerda and the Kasserine region. Italians in Tunisia largely outnumbered the French until 1931. Just to give you an idea, I show you some numbers taken from the Statistiques Générales du Protectorat de Tunisie. So that's a little bit of demography. So it was a very big community at the end of 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, one of the biggest Italian immigrated communities in MENA region. Italian presence was settled in the northern part of Tunisia and in its coast, as we can see. Tunisian case is quite particular because Italians were much more than French, but they were not the colonizers. As Albert Memmi wrote, the Italians, especially the workers, were between the colonizers and the colonized, even though closer to the French as a citizen of a Western European power who had imperialist and colonial ambition. And we can see other picture of this community. These are picture about Sardinian mine workers. This picture show also some characteristic of this social characteristic of this immigration, because Sardinians emigrate was a male migration. They migrate lonely males, and they stay just for a little time, and then they come back in Sardinia. And Sicilian farmers, Sicilians came with the family, and they settled for the agricultural work. And so it's a different kind of immigration. They stayed a lot of more, and they really put roots in Tunisia. There was also industrial activities. There was exportation of dates in the south of Tunisia. And there was also some Italians who make pasta, the pasta makers. And it's quite particular, the fact that in Bilderja, pasta, it's macarona, and in Sicilian as well. So there is a kind of, this kind of connection between the Sicilian dialect and the Derja, the Arabic dialect. So, historiography cannot underestimate the importance of the French occupation of Tunisia in France-Italy relations. When in 1881 France conquered Tunisia, the Italian Prime Minister Benedetto Cairoli dismissed. Italian liberal governments considered Tunisia like a possible or a future colony, or at least as a space under its sphere of economic and political influence. From then onwards, Italian nationalists considered the loss of Tunisia as a proof of the political weakness of the governments in dealing with colonial and international issues. Tunisia was regarded as an unredeemed colony. The loss of Tunis was a kind of a colonial nightmare in Italian public opinion. Pamphlets, public discourses, and speeches made during the 19th century portrayed the loss of Tunisia as a national shame, a lost occasion. I claim that this colonial trauma of loss of Tunis had a significant role in shaping Italian public opinion, and this feeling was reinforced by the presence of a big Italian community in Tunisia. The presence of almost 90,000 of Italians in Tunisia and of a nationalist upper class prevented Italians at home and abroad to leave the memory behind. It was after the French occupation of Tunisia that Italy started to look at Tripolitania as a possible colonial compensation. So Tunisia, or better the loss of it, played a significant role in Italian aims towards Libya. From the beginning, Tunisia and Libya, more precisely Tripolitania, were linked in these colonial aspirations of Rome. The political aftermath of the Treaty of Bardo in 1882 are known. It pushed Italy to embrace an anti-France international policy that lasted until 1896. An international agreement in 1896 between France and Italy put an end to the diplomatic crisis. Italy recognized the French protection over Tunisia, and France permitted the activities of Italian associations, institutions, and schools, and most important thing, let the Italian citizenship to the Tunisian born from Italian parents. The nationalist upper class saw in the poor and the working class migrants the colonial legitimacy to Italian aims to Libya. According to nationalists, emigration was a proof that Italians had to expand and conquer new lands. Migration became the avant-garde of Italian expansion in the world. This discourse, this narrative, this narration was often used to justify Italy's colonial ambitions, making Tunisia a central point of the colonial migrant narrative. The will of Sicilian peasants and Sardinian mine workers to move abroad was a proof of the colonial attitude of the Italian people. In May 1905, The former Foreign Affairs Minister Antonino Paternò Castello, Marquis of San Giuliano, visited Tunisia, in particular the Italians of Tunisia. To the international appeasement with France corresponded also a new approach as far as Italian claims towards French Tunisia were concerned. Antonino di San Giuliano released his declaration, I quote, "It is necessary that the two most important nations of Latin civilization don't be jealous of each other for the development and the expansion they acquired in order to assure to this civilization the place it deserves in the world. France-Italy contrasts were resolved by the creation of this kind of Latin civilization, which saw the two countries collaborate in Africa with the common purpose of helping the continent and its people to progress. This vague idea of humanitarian progress substituted the real colonial rivalry. The word Latin was used to hide the contrast between the two colonial powers in order to include the Italians into the class of colonizers, thanks to the common Latin origin. The idea of a Latin Africa served to legitimate the presence of Italians in Tunisia. Furthermore, for the Italian government, the notion of the idea of a Latin Africa served to neutralize, at least rhetorically, French colonial primacy in Maghreb. On the contrary, for the French, the concept was useful in order to affirm its leading role on European minorities living in French Maghreb, like Italians or Maltese in Tunisia or Spanish citizens in Algeria or Morocco. Clearly, this rhetoric of Latin colonial friendship could not erase the rivalry. Colonial authorities in Tunisia wanted to assimilate Italians in the French community with the goal of suppressing this kind of Italian question in Tunisia. According to the Italo-Tunisian elite, political distinction between the two countries did not mean to abdicate a colonial mission. On the contrary, it had to encourage Italian government to accomplish its part in this Latin colonization duty. During a reception party to visiting students from Sicilian universities, Luigi Mascia, director of the Italian High School of Tunis, underlined the relevance of Italian Tunisia in a colonial perspective, as we can see here. Harbors, railways, schools, hospitals, markets, theaters, buildings, if our fatherland couldn't put its signature in, remember that the Italian work is not foreign in this progress. Be glad in your Latin hearts as a victory of your own, because these are the true success of civilization. You have to say to the others that Carthago is dead, as rival and enemy of Rome, and in its place is born, full of energies and future, a lady in Tunisia, whose example evoke and wait for an Italian Tripoli. You have to say at the newspapers, at the reunions, at the universities, in Tunis there is no more place for our brothers, they need an Italian household. This time, the Latin rhetoric served to encourage Italian colonial expansion. Moreover, this text reconfirms that the presence of Italians in Tunisia legitimized Italy's colonial ambitions towards Tripoli. The success of Italian immigration in Tunisia was a starting point for an expansion in Libya. The definition of Latin Tunisia pointed to the importance of launching Italian colonialism. The migration of the Italian working class to Tunisia and its fundamental role in building ports, railways, houses served to stimulate the Italian colonial fantasy, enabling to compensate for the political defeat in Tunisia. In this way, the colonial trauma and the nightmare of colonial weakness could become a prophetic dream of conquest. This colonial migrant approach to the Tunisian case could be perfectly inscribed as a part of the general discourse and narrative of demographic colonialism, which saw the massive migration coming from the Italian south as an Italian colonial potential. Days after the beginning of the war in Libya in 1911, Italians living in Libya took to the streets in support of the invasion. The French colonial administration feared that the Libyan war could stir an Arabic backlash against Europeans. The outbreak of the war had a strong impact on Tunisian society and deepened the regency instability. The months following the beginning of the war were characterized by several instances of riots involving the Italians against Tunisian population. Moreover, Italian workers in Tunis lived and worked in close contact with natives, which led to competition over jobs. An article published in a French newspaper of Tunis in October 1911 pointed out that this rivalry destroyed social harmony in the Tunis suburbs where Sicilian immigrants and Tunisians lived. I quote, "Arabs and Italians lived side by side in Tunis. They stayed in the same quarter, often the same house, sometimes they speak the same language, and constantly in job concurrence. From the beginning of the war in Tripolitania, the two races are one against the other every time of their common life." End of quotation. So riots broke out in November 1911, less than a month after the outbreak of the war. The so-called Jellaz affair started as a Tunisian protest against French authorities who want to expropriate or immatriculate a Muslim cemetery in Jellaz Hill, in the suburb of Tunis. Close to the Jellaz cemetery, there was a quarter inhabited by Italians. The protest became a riot, and soon the conflict was between Italians and Tunisians. This violent turn of the protest could be seen as a result of the news of the war in Tripolitania. According to Giuliano Bonacci, correspondent for the Italian newspaper Il Corriere della Sera, Italian families were afraid of letting their children to go to school, and many sent them back to Sicily in order to avoid having them caught up in the escalation of violence. Even though some workers came back to Italy, others, according to Bonacci, wanted to move in the new Italian lands. I quote, "Multitudes of Sicilian workers of the soil and Sardinian farmers of rich mines of the Protectorate look already with passionate eyes towards east, where there is the land that our soldiers conquer with their courage and sacrifice to fatherland, and where our compatriots are sure they will find, a day not far, a well-paid job, together with peace, security, and respect under the Italian flag." End of quotation. It is worth mentioning that the colonial conquest of Libya meant for Italian immigrants in Tunisia. It is not meaningless that Bonacci openly quotes Sicilians and Sardinians. They were the two biggest regional groups that composed the Italian community in Tunisia, and they were mainly workers and peasants. The rhetorical use of southerner workers to legitimate the colonial conquest was quite common in this national narrative. An article written by Luigi D'Alessandro adds several interesting aspects. D'Alessandro was a teacher and a supervisor in the Italian schools of Tunis, and he can be considered as a member of the Italian upper class. A fervent nationalist, D'Alessandro knew perfectly how to present Italian presence in Tunisia in a positive colonial light. I quote, "Italian sweat and tears, joined with capitals, will fertilize the new conquest, and they will show it to the world. We foresee that the Italian immigration in Tunisia, already stopped, will decrease, and it will go to Tripolitania, where, owing to its experience and acclimatation, will give prosperity to the country and huge advantages." So D'Alessandro described the Italians of Tunisia as the better kind of Italian, as a colonial Italian, those who could make flourish the new fourth shore. In this view, Tunisia was extremely similar to Tripolitania. A committee composed by the Italian elite in Tunis organized and supervised the expedition of Italian workers to Tripoli in April and May 1912. The first expedition was composed by 72 workers, the second one by 142. Italian industrial workers in Tunisia believed, as did the bourgeoisie, that Libya would solve many of their social issues. As we can see here, this is a postcard sent from Homs by a former Sicilian anarchist. This is the other side of the postcards. So Antonino Casubolo was a Sicilian anarchist, and after the Libyan war, during the Libyan war, he seems to be converted to the colonialist cause after the invasion. So the nationalist and the colonialist idea of the proletarian nation created by Corradini and the illusion of the richness of Libyan lands played an important role in breaking the opposition of a socialist movement to the government in Italy as well as in Tunisia. Of course, the economic crisis of the Regency, unemployment, and the open competition between Italians and Tunisians amplified the rupture of this internationalist movement of workers in Tunisia. At the end, it's worth saying that at the end of 19th century, at the beginning of 20th century, in Tunisia, the worker movement was formed mainly by Italians, and there was an Italian anarchist web in all North Africa, from Tunis to Egypt and Algeria as well. But during the 1911, the fragmentation of social space through national boundaries in the Tunisian context became evident. The president of a socialist internationalist association, composed by Italians, asked for the help and protection of the consular authorities. He said, "As the attitude of Arabs continue and increase always more, we are scared for the life of Italians." So, social fear, colonial struggles, and nationalist narrative made the southern migrants in Tunisia a tool of Italian expansionism. Meanwhile, the Italian upper class acted as agents of Rome, monitoring the movements in the Regency that could be dangerous to the Italian invasion of Libya. Several telegrams were sent from Tunis to Rome, notifying about the movements of persons and weapons within the Tunisian borders. Il Corriere della Sera published an official letter of protest sent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, signed by 20 presidents of the Italian Association in Tunisia. They accused the government of the Regency, and so France, not doing enough to fight against smugglers. Moreover, the engagement of this elite in the Libyan conflict is confirmed by the several fundraising initiatives that they launched to support Italian colonialism. So, and we can see this kind of patriotic duty also during the First World War. The community during the First World War responded actively to the call to arms coming from Rome. 50,000 Italians coming from Tunisia fought in the trenches, and 1,500 were killed during the conflict. They were enrolled into the Italian army according to their regional origins. Even if born in Tunisia, they were enrolled in the military district of their fathers or ancestors. For instance, Livornese Jews with Italian citizenship born in Tunisia enrolled in the Livorno military district. A group of these Italians attended the same school in Tunis. In the case of Jews from Livorno, there was the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and enrolled the same troop, the 26esimo Reggimento Fanteria, in the Italian army. Born in the same city, went to the same school, enrolled the same troop, and died during the same attack during the Third Battle of Isonzo in Santa Lucia, a little hill near to Tolmino, and Cobrid, Caporetto, now in Slovenian territory. These young men died for a country in which they had never lived. So, at the end of 1916, the number of Italians born in Tunisia fighting for Italy was this. And considering the total number of Italians in Tunisia, it is possible to claim that more or less the 10% of the community was at the war. And we can see that there was 700 fallen soldiers that were inscribed as martyrs of the fatherland. This report adds that about 480 living in Tunisia dodged the draft claiming. According to the author of this report, they wanted just to set the economic conditions of their families before going to the war front. In fact, social conditions in Tunisia were rough and got worse with the beginning of World War I. The Italian consular authority and the local association were aware that the situation was getting critical. In order to respond, they created a welfare system that helped the impoverished Italian working class. The families of the young men sent to the front suffered the most, and the Italian state endeavored to improve their situation. These poor families were assisted by local committees called Opera d'Assistenza, which were set up in several Tunisian cities and villages. Economic subsidies were allocated in all Italian centers in Tunisia. Therefore, national authorities attempt to help the expatriated population in Tunisia. Furthermore, this web of charity associations allowed Italy to maintain connection with the immigrants. This kind of welfare
was raised from the Italian local upper class to the lowest, so it could be seen as a tool of a social hegemony through a paternalistic assistance. The necessity for the creation of this association in the territory of the Regency reveals that the main part of the Italian community in Tunisia was poor and suffered deeply as a result of the economic crisis. As pointed out before, social and regional differences played a fundamental role in determining the features of this expatriated community. Italian Southern question had consequences in Tunisia as well. When considering the regional origins of the indigent families that benefit from Italian welfare in Tunisia, it becomes evident that Sicilian immigrants remain among the less prosperous. It is worth remarking that the access to this social welfare was subordinate to the patriotic duty to the national war. Only families whose men had enlisted were able to receive it. 86% were Sicilians, and 60% of them lived in Tunis and its region. This high percentage of Sicilians among the needy underlines not only the strong link between regional and social composition of the Italian community in Tunisia, but also the fact that the poorest member of the community often had chosen urban settings living in Tunis. This huge amount of needy immigrated families is surprising if considering that during 1914 the Italian consulate had repatriated many poor Sicilian workers. After the war, the Italian community wanted to play the role of a mediator between Italy and Libya. So the Arab rebellion and the First World War jeopardized the Italian rule in Tripolitania. The Italian bourgeoisie, upper class in Tunisia, decided to start a serious colonizing project for Tripolitania, even though Italy controlled only a limited part of the country. Once again, Tunisia was seen as Italy's almost colony. An interesting report written in 1919 by Salvatore Calò underlines how the Libyan War and the First World War played an important role in shaping Italian national identity among the expatriated community. Calò, he was an important businessman, was the president of the Italian Commercial Association, vice president of the Italian Credit Union of Tunisia, and administrator of the Principe di Piemonte Orphanage, and an influent member of Dante Alighieri Committee. So, concerned by the attitude toward French colonial authorities, he declared, "Such friendship between Italy and France cannot last if not underpinned by mutual respect, absolute respect of rights of both sides, keeping a unique privilege of equal civilization. We want to be considered like the citizens of an equal civilization, also because the inevitable consequence of our colony in Libya." So, therefore, according to this prominent exponent of the Italian upper class in Tunisia, Italians deserved more respect from the French authorities as a consequence, a result of the Italian conquest of Libya. Moreover, he goes on the report by repeating that the Italian experience in Tunisia prepared the country for the invasion and exploitation of Libya. So, he said, "We have to consider that Tunisia was to us a precious camp of experiences in the study of colonial politics and economics. We have in Tunisia all the necessary organization to make it the starting point to a rapid assimilation of Libya to the Italian interests, and a point of economic and industrial irradiation towards Algeria and Morocco." So, to sum up, to conclude, Tunisia played an important role in Italian colonial aspiration. At first, the loss of this almost colony to France was a national shame. Emigration rubbed salt into the wound. As a result of this humiliation, the Kingdom of Italy started looking at the conquest of Tripolitania and a way to soothe its wounded ego and strengthen its weak international position. Meanwhile, the national identity of the Italian community in Tunisia was shaped by the necessity to coexist with the French and Tunisians.
Italian aspiration on Libya also played a role in determining the relationship of the Italian in Tunisia with the local population and in molding its sense of belonging to the Italian nation. Several events highlight the importance of the Libyan conflict, the participation to the Libyan war through public subscription and the convoy of workers to Tripoli, the massive success of the military recruitment campaign, the low number of draft dodgers, the community welfare during the First World War. All these can be interpreted as a signal of a nation building among these Italian people in the south coast of the Mediterranean. On the other hand, it's possible to point out that the colonialist rhetoric and the social assistance provided by the Italian government to the neediest members of the society weakened the socialist and the internationalist movement. The war in Libya and its aftermath, and Italian initial neutrality in World War I, and the later intervention allowed the nationalist bourgeoisie to strengthen their social, economic, and cultural hegemony on the whole Italian community in Tunisia. This elite living in Tunisia wanted to lead a renewed, a greater Italy, a country finally able to show its power and the strength through colonial possession. In the rhetoric of Italian colonialism, Tunisia was the first step towards the creation of this new Italy. Sicilian farmers and Sardinian miners would lead the way to conquest of Libya. So, therefore, I hope this presentation shows how Italian nation building took place in a foreign colonial space and the colonial rhetoric in nationalizing immigrants. In this picture, I choose this picture because I think that it's very important. These are some students of the Italian college in it was close to Bab Jadid in Tunis, and La patria riposa sui forti, and means the fatherland rests on the strong man, and the composition it's like a fire. So it's also to show up how this nationalizing project came from and through the schooling, the Italian schooling, and the importance of the national buildings in the through schooling. So thank you for your attention.
Introduction, I wanted to introduce or to recognize that the Center for Maghrébine Studies in Tunis, CEMAT, is our co-sponsor here, and its director, my friend and colleague, Larissa Joniak, has been instrumental in bringing this together, so I wanted to bring that together. I wanted to start with a question, if I may. We will entertain questions, and hopefully you will take a question. And one of the things I wanted to start with, could you talk a little bit about the role of the Vatican and also in Catholic charities, particularly the role of convents and nuns and hospitals, and how they might have fit in to this idea of a national building? Did they run concurrent with, were they part of this political movement, or did they work separately? So that was my first question.
And thank you for your question. It's very important, the role of Vatican and of course the role of Catholic religion in the Italian community, and it's very interesting the policy, or the French policy towards these issues. For instance, Cardinal Lavigeri wanted to separate the Sicilian community from the Italian one through Catholic religion. For instance, he created a little church in Tunis. It's called Santa Lucia dei Siciliani, Saint Lucie des Siciliens, in order to separate the idea of the Sicilians from the other Italians, and to integrate this kind of a Sicilian group in this idea of a French-led group. And French colonialism in Tunisia used Catholic churches and Catholic religion to assimilate Italians in the French group. But at the same time, we can see a popular religion among the Sicilians that kept these Sicilians with their own identity. For instance, it's quite well known that in Lagulete there is Santa Maria di Trapani during the 15th of August. It was a really important celebration for Catholics, and it came from a Sicilian tradition. But also through Catholic, to the Catholic religion, we can see a kind of transnational Italianness. I mean, between Catholics, we can see in some documents in the archives of the Archevêché de Tunis, we can see the use of the Italian languages between Sicilians, Maltese, French, Corse. So it was like the idea of a transnational Italianness through the transnational religion, because the religion is transnational, yeah, more or less. And it's very interesting because there's a kind of a parallel with the international socialist movement, this kind of identity, transnational identity. And of course it's very important, and it was just to sum up the answer, from the hierarchical point of view, the Vatican hierarchy wanted to assimilate these immigrants in the French group, because there was some clash between at the time there wasn't Vatican City, there was a clash between the Italian governments and the Pope. And so from a hierarchical point of view, there was this kind of clash. But from a popular point of view, from a popular point of view, there was this kind of mixity between these kind of different Catholic groups. Yes, yeah.
Italian on the base on the ethnicity and on the language that they spoke. You mentioned that at the time we can't really talk about Italy as a country. And can you tell us about the difference between the ancient Italian, like for example those who were captured by pirates? For example, we know the story of the descendant of Bejakai Tsipsi, who was captured there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that they were from upper class, and the local bourgeoisie or aristocracy who was not Italian, like those class things, take in consideration the ethnic component of it.
The idea of Italian belonging was really a cultural idea that was spread from an upper class to the others. And in this case, in the Tunisian case, it's true that we had some merchants, and I mean the ancient Italians in Tunisia were some were merchants and others were slaves. But it's not this difference is not like upper class or lower class, because, for instance, during the period of Ahmed Bey in 1846. The foreign minister of Ahmed Bey was Giuseppe Raffo, and he was the son of a slave. So there was a kind of a really important social mobility in between the slaves, the Western slaves in the Tunisian Belgrade. So some slaves could, the son of the slaves, or maybe just the Western slaves, could reach an important function in the administration. So we had some ancient slaves who could become ministers, and other that were just keep their social position. So yes, this after the belonging to the Italian national identity came after, during the middle of 19th century. So it was something little by little. This bourgeoisie, this upper class, started to look at this Italian national identity to strengthen their social social identity. This was a group of dhimmi, some people that were under this administration. Then, thanks to the power of the consular power, try to strengthen their social identity, to asking the citizenship during the 1848, 1850. Lots of these Italian-speaking dhimmi in Tunisia try to ask to Sardinian consulate authorities or Napolitan authorities citizenship to then have a kind of consular protection. So it's a very complex way of construct the identity. Yeah.
I have two questions. First question, do you know how advanced were the plans to annex Tunisia in Italy when during the end of the 19th century, right before France stepped in? And the second question is, were there any subversive action by the Italians living in Tunisia against the French annexation after 1881?
So when we speak about the fact that Tunisia was considered like almost colony, it's because during the 1833 and 1836, also the kingdom of Piedmont, the kingdom of Sardinia, before the Italian unification, had some clashes against the Tunisian kingdom. So there was there was already this kind of a colonial interest, because there was lots of merchants, Italian merchants, who had lots of economic interest in the public debt of Tunisia. And it's worth saying that the International Commission in 1860 was composed by England businessmen, French businessmen, and Italian businessmen. So, and with the International Commission, the finances of the Kingdom of Tunisia was really tied up. So there was this kind of, from the beginning, this kind of a colonial perspective. And when France invaded Tunisia, there wasn't from Italy some really reaction, military reaction, because Italy was quite weak, and it wasn't really not clever to start a war against France in 1882 against France, because Italy was a really newborn state, newborn nation, and for this reason there wasn't a clash. There was a diplomatic and political crisis, but not a war for the weakness of the Italian kingdom.
What about the Italians living in Tunisia?
The Italian living in Tunisia was against this kind of invasion, but didn't show up like a really clash, because it would have been necessary, the intervention from the Italian state, some kind of ships from the Italian state to protect the community. So it doesn't show up these kind of things, and they were just against, and they wrote some letters to Rome to protect their interests, but not really a clash against the French army, for instance.
This is the first time I've ever heard about a socialist movement in North Africa. So how long did it last, and did you think it helped setting a mindset for later establishing the General Union of Tunisian Workers?
When I spoke about the socialist movement in Tunisia, was formed by these trade unions, formed mainly by Italians. It was trade unions linked to some kind of work. There were mine workers trade unions and these kind of things. There was also an anarchist web formed by Italian anarchists. And only during in 1906 there was a huge mass strike in all Tunisian land, and there was a kind of a connection between a common strike between Italians and Tunisians, but that was the only point in which there was this kind of a link, because in colonial Tunisia, in French Tunisia, there were three kinds of how could I say, three kinds of work. I mean, for the same work there were three kinds of salary. If there were a French worker, there was le tiers colonial, so they were paid more. If Italians, much less, and if Tunisian, much less. So for these kind of differences, it was really difficult to create a really international worker or strikes. Only in this kind of in this specific moment in 1906, there was this link. But after no, and because of also this the war on Libya in 1911 and the First World War. And another period in which there was this kind of link was during the Italian anti-fascist movement, and during the 1930s, after the assassinate of Giuseppe Micheli in, if I remember well, it was in 1937. There was a huge mass demonstration in Tunis, Avenue Jules Ferry, now Avenue Bourguiba, with Italians, French, and Tunisians against fascist regime and against, against fascist regime. So that was the only moments in which this radical political movement, Italian movements, were linked to to the Tunisian population. I'm doing my research, and I hope to find more in this in the archives.
I wanted to compete with Italian language in the beginning of the establishment of the protectorate. Like, for example, in Ecole Pratique, they wanted to replace Italian by more French classes, etc. So what was the reaction of the Italian community? Was it the creation of more Italian schools? And I have another question. Do you know if Vatican became more influent and more present after the law of 1905, the separation between the church and the state? No more. Do you know if it became more present after this law?
So after the French invasion, there was this kind of Francization in a lot of institutions, and this colonial nightmare that I was saying was also because these kind of things. I mean, the suppression of Italian languages in some institution was really an important thing, and Italian government, for this reason, for the reason of the French invasion, for this colonial nightmare, for this colonial defeat, colonial weakness, it couldn't really interfere with this. They could protest against France, but France was was under French rule, so it was really difficult to keep these kind of things. But at the same time, they strengthened their web association and schools. For this reason, they kept these lots of schools in Tunisia, in Tunis, and also in other cities. There is other association to keep the national identity, something like that. But it's true that after the French invasion, this was this Italian heritage. The Italian languages in Tunisia had a kind of backlash. For instance, not Sadiki, but the school, the military school of Bardo, was founded by an Italian, a Piemontese, Luigi Caligaris, that was a political refugee that found in Tunisia, host country. And he was the first director of this military school of Bardo. And after, when the French invaded, when the French came, they was dismissed to put a French general. So, for the second question, we know that with the law about the separation between state and religion in France. There was a clash between France and the Pope. But we have to underline that after the Italian unification, until at least 1911, with the during more or less Libyan war and what in Italy is called the Patto Gentiloni, so an agreement between Italian state and the church. So from the Italian unification in 1861 to the 1911, Italian government, Italian state was really against church. It was really a diplomatic crisis because Pope state didn't recognize Italian state who had invaded the pontifical territories. So for this reason, church didn't during the crisis against France didn't go to Italian rule to try to have a support from Italy, because Italy was also in this kind of diplomatic crisis with church. But it's also true that in colonial space, like in Tunisia, they wanted to keep. French and church wanted to keep the things easier, because also they didn't want to convert Muslim people. So it was just the religion for French and Italians, and not for converted to expand in converting. So I hope I answered your question.
Presentation. I also worked a little on this colonial period in France, and I know that this presentation is taking us up to World War I, but can you talk a little bit about the period after? So you sort of gestured in the demographics at the fact that the Italian population is larger than the French population until the 1930s. But what happens after that is that the Italian population actually declines in size pretty rapidly, and the French population accelerates. And so, can you talk about why there's a decline in the Italian population at that time?
Decline of Italian population after the 30s had a different explanation. For instance, one was it's that the huge migration from Italy to Tunisia was at the end of the 18th century, more or less. The big huge immigration between 1898 to the 1902-03. So in the 1930s, we have lots of Italian born in Tunisia, and the other, just to. So in 1906 we have lots of Italians, but they mostly are Italians that came from Italy, and they kept their nationality. In 1931 there are lots of Italians born in Tunisia that are really acclimated in Tunisian society, and Tunisian society meant to be in contact with the French administration, more or less. And lots of were farmers. The Sicilian farmers were more or less 80% of the community. So they stay in the land. They was quite fixed. So little by little, the new generation, even though the Italian nationalist project was to keep this generation Italian, even this new generation of Italian born in Tunisia try to get the French citizenship, and also because during the 30s we are in the middle, more or less. I mean, there is the fascist regime that has started during 1922, and fascist regime and there are lots of diplomatic crises against France. So to have a much more easier life between relation between Italians and Tunisian and French. Lots of Italians in Tunisia that haven't lived in Italy and they didn't know what Italy was, decided to get the French citizenship. So for this reason, during the 30s, we have this change, and of course, the big change was after the Second World War. With the Second World War, there was a huge naturalization of Italians. Most of them became French citizens, and after the First World War, what we can define, I mean, the end of this history was the nationalization of the land in 1964, which lots of Sicilian or Italian landowners have to sell their lands in the independent Tunisia. So there are lots of historical events that help to denationalize this Italian community.
Can I ask one wrap up question? Did your research include uniting the Italian community or Italian citizens, and to what extent they were involved in journalism, which was very thriving at this particular time, and also creative literature? Have you worked on that? And again, what kinds of things do the community as a collective articulate? Is Italian identity in some way articulated through the press or through creative writing?
Yeah, well, one of the main issues is how this Italian community presented itself, and the newspapers is, according to me, are one of the most important things for this community to see itself in paper. The language was spread, the Italian language was spread through the newspapers. The most known Italian newspaper was L'Unione, the union, the idea of this union of all Italian communities. And there were lots of Italian newspapers, and for instance, one of the most interesting newspaper was a newspaper called Simpaticuni. It was written, some articles in this newspaper. It was a satiric newspaper. Some articles were written in Sicilian dialect, and others were wrote in Sicilian Tunisian dialect. So I mean, with the Sicilian words, some French words, other Tunisian words translated in Italian. So we have, thanks to this newspaper Simpaticuni, we had an idea of which kind of language was really spoken in Tunisia, in Tunis, souk or something like that. But for the nationalist project, the main newspaper, like L'Unione, helped to strengthen this national identity. And what I think, it's also the anarchist newspapers helped to spread not a national project, but an idea of Italianness not linked to the nationalist project, transnational Italianness. Because, for instance, there was a newspaper, an anarchist newspaper called L'Operaio, that was the newspaper of anarchists of Sicily and Malta, for instance. So the idea that Italian languages was a tool, and not just a tool for the national identity, but a tool also for workers, the Italian-related dialects like the Sicilian, Maltese. So yeah, the newspaper, this kind of literature was the main part of this narration.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Second thing, I want to know your opinion about the topics of civilizations within Tunisia and Italy. And I was want to know if it's a real process or it's just a mix between those two cultures that gives us the heritage and the culture that we have today.
It's a very difficult question. I mean, according to me, in Mediterranean place and between Italy and Tunisia, there were ever been relation between the countries, and relation means contacts and means also contrast, and it's quite normal to have this some kind of contrast and contact with different cultures. But I don't think that really this. I think in my opinion, like, and that this kind of a clash of civilization is something that was, geared by some upper class and some nationalist project to strengthen from idea to another. Is not really something that belong to the people, to the countries who are really keen on cross-boarding from Sicily to Tunisia or from Tunisia to Sicily. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm interested in hearing maybe a little bit more about. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the French strategy for populating Tunisia with individuals holding French nationality, and specifically your remark earlier about how Italians were interested perhaps in the 1930s in acquiring French nationality. I've read in the past, and I don't know if this is correct, but that in the 1920s there was a law indicating that all foreigners born to foreigners who had been born on Tunisian soil were themselves French. So I'm wondering if that's true, but I'm also wondering more about kind of an overarching strategy that the French had in basically overcoming this demographic obstacle that they saw, which they wanted to control Tunisia, but they were concerned about all of the Italians that were here.
During the 20s, there was it was just after the First World War, and there was this this new law to Tunisian in Tunisia to nationalize the foreigners. But this law was applied for it was mainly applied for the Maltese population, because the Italian community had an international agreement made up during in 1896 between Italy and France to keep the Italian identity, the Italian citizenship. So the law, the French law in the 20s wasn't to nationalize Italians, but the Maltese, Anglo-Maltese population and the others. So it was in this demographic will of organize the population that France wanted to assimilate other foreign population, other foreign population, but in particularly European Western population. And for instance, what France did in Algeria with the Spanish. And this was what I was trying to say about this kind of a Latin civilization, the Latin Africa, the idea of a new kind of a Frenchman of Africa that has some Spanish or Italian or Maltese origins, but thanks to this French dream, to this French melting pot, a French African melting pot, become a Frenchman in Africa. So this idea of a new Latin man, it's very well spread in all Western Europe, and in France had this kind of particular issue of, to become the French, the African French. And it was that, and it was the idea of to assimilate, to strengthen their position in Africa, because. Thanks to this was a problem that came from the fact that Tunisia kept this kind of half independence. The idea of the protectorate. Tunisia was not a colony. It was not like Algeria. It was a protectorate for this divided sovereignty, this divided rule, as the Professor Lewis from Harvard University said, kept this idea of a separated rule between France and Tunisia, and so a Tunisian identity, so the impossibility to France to nationalize all Tunisian born, because it was some problem about these legal problems, international legal problems about the idea of protectorate. So.
Stop there. Gabriele, thank you very much.
Thank you all.